March 1944, and 12 Luftwaffe interceptors are streaming upward through broken clouds. Their gun sights locked on a single American silhouette, but their bullets will never find him. He didn't twist, he didn't dive, he didn't pull into a desperate turning fight. He simply vanished into the horizon at a speed their aircraft couldn't match. A 22-year-old corn farmer from the Iowa plains had just shattered every rule of aerial combat and exposed a fatal flaw in German fighter doctrine that no strategist had ever anticipated. The skies above the German heartland in early 1940 had become the deadliest airspace on Earth. American heavy bombers thundered eastward every morning the weather permitted, their aluminum skins catching sunlight. As they carved long white contrails across the frozen upper atmosphere, hundreds of aircraft flew in precise geometric formations at 40,000 feet. Their crews breathing bottled oxygen and shivering despite heated flight suits. The landscape below stretched in patchwork squares of forest and farmland, crisscrossed by rivers and railroad lines that led to factories, refineries, and cities marked for destruction. Above the bomber streams, there was only empty blue sky and the absolute certainty that German interceptors were already climbing to meet them. American doctrine was brutally straightforward. Bombers maintained course and altitude regardless of opposition. Fighter escorts stayed close until enemy aircraft appeared. When the Germans came, American fighters were expected to break formation and engage aggressively, destroy the threat before it reached the vulnerable heavies. This was the orthodoxy. This was how aerial warfare was supposed to work. But the mathematics of attrition were devastating. For every German fighter that fell burning from the sky, American losses accumulated relentlessly. Not just bombers torn apart by cannon fire, but fighters too. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings found themselves drawn into swirling vertical battles against Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. These engagements consumed enormous quantities of fuel and bled away precious altitude. Pilots who survived described confusion and violence beyond comprehension. Pilots who didn't survive left only silence and empty bunks. The North American P-51 Mustang had revolutionized the strategic equation by extending escort range all the way to Berlin and back. But during those early months of 1944, American fighter pilots still approached combat with instincts forged in the Pacific Islands and North African deserts. They had been trained to turn hard, to pursue aggressively, to close the distance and kill. The Mustang provided unprecedented endurance, but tactical thinking remained anchored in close-range violence. Nobody had yet posed the most fundamental question imaginable. What if engaging the enemy was itself the mistake? What if pure velocity could accomplish what bullets and turning fights could not? The concept seemed either cowardly or delusional. But it was neither. It was aerodynamics, and one unremarkable young officer from America's agricultural heartland was about to demonstrate it. In the most dramatic fashion possible. His name was Second Lieutenant Robert William Buholtz. He had grown up on a working farm in central Iowa, where the land stretched flat to every horizon and the wind blew constantly across endless fields of corn and soybeans. His family raised livestock and grew crops the way generations before them had done. Hard work was simply existence. Complaining about it was pointless. From childhood, he had possessed an unusual relationship with machinery. Tractors, harvesters, trucks, irrigation pumps, anything mechanical that broke down became his responsibility to repair. He learned to diagnose problems by sound and vibration. He understood how systems functioned and why they failed. A carburetor that hesitated before stalling, a bearing that whined before seizing. He absorbed these patterns without conscious effort, filing them away in a mind naturally suited to mechanical reasoning. He spoke sparingly, not from shyness, but from efficiency. Words cost effort, and effort was better spent on productive work. He listened carefully when others talked, noting details that escaped less attentive observers. Teachers found him unremarkable. Neighbors considered him dependable. Nobody imagined he would become a combat pilot. When war came, he enlisted because everyone enlisted. There was no grand patriotic awakening, no burning desire for adventure. The nation required men, and he was a man of military age. He went because going was expected. Flight training unfolded in the brutal Texas heat, where dust storms sandblasted aircraft and temperatures inside cockpits became nearly unbearable. He was not a natural aviator in the traditional sense. Some cadets seemed born to fly, their coordination effortless and instinctive. Buholtz approached aviation as he approached farming equipment methodically, analytically, studying how each component contributed to the whole. He memorized technical manuals. He questioned instructors about aerodynamic principles. He thought constantly about energy states and velocity and the three-dimensional geometry of flight. He completed training successfully, if unspectacularly, and received assignment to P-51 Mustangs. By late winter of 1944, he found himself stationed with the 357th Fighter Group at Leiston Airfield in Suffolk, England. The base was perpetually damp, perpetually cold, and perpetually noisy. Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roared at all hours as aircraft launched and recovered. Mission briefings began in freezing darkness. The food was adequate at best. The coffee tasted like motor oil. The only genuine comfort came from the knowledge that he was flying arguably the finest long-range fighter aircraft ever built. Buholtz was not an ace. He had no confirmed kills. He carried no colorful nickname, and his Mustang bore no distinctive nose art. He was a reliable wingman, the kind of pilot who maintained formation discipline and protected his flight leader's vulnerable rear quarter. He was exactly the sort of aviator who rarely appeared in headlines or received medals. But he had been observing, mission after mission. He watched American fighters react to German interceptors. He saw experienced pilots haul their aircraft into tight turning pursuits, following enemy fighters into vertical scissors and rolling engagements. He watched fuel gauges plummet as engines screamed at maximum power through prolonged maneuvering. He saw formations scatter across miles of hostile sky as individual pilots became separated and vulnerable. And he kept returning to one inescapable technical fact: the P-51 Mustang, in straight and level flight at high altitude, was faster than virtually every frontline German fighter, not in climbing ability, not in instantaneous turn rate, but in simple, sustained horizontal velocity. With the Merlin engine at war emergency power, a Mustang could exceed 430 miles per hour in level cruise. The Focke-Wulf 190 maxed out around 410. The Messerschmitt 109 climbed beautifully, but couldn't match that straight-line pace, which raised an obvious question that apparently nobody was asking. Why were American pilots turning to fight when they could simply accelerate beyond pursuit range? He mentioned this observation cautiously to his wingmen and a few trusted squadron mates. Some listened thoughtfully. Others dismissed the idea as naive or cowardly. One pilot asked the obvious counter-question. What happens if you run and they catch you anyway? Now you're alone, out of position, and they dive on you from above with every advantage. Buholtz had no complete answer. But he suspected he was right, and he intended to find out. March 19th, 1944. Target, Berlin. Again, the American bomber force assembled over England in the pre-dawn blackness, hundreds of aircraft converging. From dozens of airfields into a massive aerial armada, ground crews worked frantically in the cold, topping off fuel tanks and checking ammunition loads. Pilots studied maps and weather forecasts, mentally rehearsing routes and emergency procedures. The 357th Fighter Group launched at 0900 hours. Buholtz flew wing position for his flight leader, an aggressive captain with 2 confirmed victories and a reputation for pursuing fights rather than avoiding them. The mission profile was standard escort doctrine: accompany the heavies into enemy airspace, remain close until threatened, engage and destroy any German aircraft that approached. They crossed the English Channel at 25,000 feet. The sky was cold blue emptiness. The North Sea below resembled hammered grey metal. Inside the cockpit, the Merlin engine produced a constant reassuring vibration. The confined space smelled of oil and hydraulic fluid and nervous perspiration. Crossing the Dutch coastline, anti-aircraft fire began reaching upward. Black flak bursts appeared at staggered altitudes, searching for the correct height. The bomber stream flew through it stoically. Fighter escorts weaved gently, unpredictable enough to complicate targeting solutions. Nobody was hit. Then the radio call came. Bandits. High 11 o'clock position. Buholtz scanned the designated quadrant and found them. 12 contacts climbing aggressively out of the haze layer far below. Focke-Wulf 190s predominantly, possibly with a few Messerschmitts mixed in. They were ascending rapidly, angling to intercept the bomber formation. His flight leader called. The brake. American fighters rolled inverted and pulled toward the earth, diving to meet the threat before it could reach the bombers. Buholtz followed initially, his nose dropping toward the distant German fighters. But something stopped him, some instinct or observation he couldn't quite articulate. The angle of the German climb was too steep to sustain. They weren't fully committing. They were watching, waiting, drawing the American escorts downward and away from their protective positions. He made his decision in an instant. He pulled out of the dive, rolled wings level, and pushed his throttle completely forward to the war emergency power detent. The Merlin engine responded with a full-throated roar. The Mustang surged forward as if released from restraint. The airspeed indicator needle climbed rapidly 350, 370, 400. His flight leader and the rest of the American formation continued diving toward the German bait. Buholtz was suddenly alone, accelerating westward in level flight, engine screaming at maximum output. And then he saw them. 8 additional German fighters, positioned higher and further back, exactly where they could pounce on American escorts, who had committed to the low engagement. They had been waiting for precisely this situation. They spotted the lone Mustang immediately. 8 noses swung toward him. 8 throttles advanced. The pursuit began. Buholtz experienced a moment of absolute clarity. He didn't panic. He didn't reverse course to fight. He simply maintained his heading and kept the throttle against the stop. The Merlin continued accelerating. Airspeed passed for 110, then for 120. The pursuing Germans reacted according to their training. They rolled into pursuit curves, diving slightly to convert altitude into speed, throttles at maximum. They had numerical superiority, energy advantage, and a clear target. The American was dead. He simply didn't know it yet, except he wasn't. Buholtz held the Mustang absolutely straight. Airspeed reached 425. The airframe shuddered slightly from compressibility buffeting in the thin high-altitude air. He trimmed the nose down fractionally to maintain acceleration. His engine temperature gauge crept toward the red zone. He watched it and decided he didn't care. He had perhaps 5 minutes at this power setting before something mechanical failed. He needed far less. Behind him, German fighters opened fire. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, the glowing projectiles falling increasingly short as the range opened. A few passed close enough that he could see the phosphorescent trails flickering past his wingtips. None connected, because they weren't closing. They were falling behind. The Focke-Wulfs were fast aircraft, superbly designed for climb rate and roll performance. But they simply could not match a Mustang in sustained level flight at this altitude. The speed differential was perhaps 20 miles per hour, insignificant in a turning fight, but absolutely decisive in a straight pursuit. The German formation began stretching apart. Faster aircraft pulled slightly ahead. Slower ones dropped back. Their firing solutions degraded steadily as the range increased. 100 yards became 200. 200 became 500. The gap continued widening. Buholtz checked his mirror. The pursuing fighters were still visible, but noticeably smaller, losing ground with every passing second. His engine temperature was solidly in the red now. Oil pressure fluctuated ominously. The airframe vibrated with stress, rivets buzzing in their holes. The Merlin was giving him absolutely everything it had, and it was enough. One by one, the German pilots broke off pursuit. They recognized the futility. They were burning irreplaceable fuel chasing an aircraft they could not catch. Their own doctrine demanded they conserve resources for engagements they could actually win. Buholtz counted them peeling away. 3, 5, 7, 8. All of them. He was alone in an empty sky. No friendlies visible. No enemies in pursuit. Just endless blue and the fading white scratches of contrails behind him. He throttled back carefully, allowing the tortured engine to cool. He checked his instruments. Everything remained functional barely. He had burned a frightening quantity of fuel, but he was still airborne, still flying toward home. He had survived not by fighting, but by refusing to fight, and he had just demonstrated something that conventional wisdom insisted was impossible. You could outrun them. Buholtz landed at least 90 minutes later. His crew chief noticed the damage immediately. The engine cowling paint had blistered from excessive heat. Dark oil streaks ran along the fuselage. The Merlin engine ticked and pinged as superheated metal contracted, cooling from its ordeal. Buholtz climbed from the cockpit on unsteady legs. His flight suit was drenched with perspiration. His hands trembled from adrenaline slowly releasing. He reported to the intelligence officer and described the engagement in his usual sparse manner. 12 initial interceptors, 8 additional fighters in ambush position, decision to disengage, successful escape through superior speed. The intelligence officer recorded everything without commentary. But information spreads rapidly on fighter bases. By evening, half the group had heard the story. A lieutenant had outrun 12 German fighters without firing a single round. He simply accelerated and disappeared. Opinions divided sharply. Some pilots considered it cowardice dressed up as tactics. Others recognized the brilliance immediately. Buholtz himself offered no defense and sought no validation. He knew what had happened. More importantly, he knew it could be repeated. Within weeks, other pilots in the 357th began testing the approach, not as primary doctrine, but as survival option when outnumbered, when fuel was critical, when the tactical situation offered no advantage. Instead of turning into hopeless fights, they ran. Throttle forward, level flight, maximum sustainable speed. It worked consistently. German pilots began reporting an unsettling pattern: American fighters that refused engagement, Mustangs that simply accelerated and vanished into the distance. Luftwaffe radio intercepts from April and May 1944 contain repeated frustrated references to pursuit targets that could not be caught in level flight. The tactics spread beyond the 357th to other fighter groups. Briefing officers began mentioning it not as official doctrine, but as practical wisdom. If the fight cannot be won, don't fight it. Use your speed advantage. Survive to fly another mission. The impact on casualty statistics was measurable. 8th Air Force fighter losses per sortie declined noticeably through spring 1944. The reasons were multiple: growing experience, improving tactics, better coordination. But part of the improvement traced directly to one quiet farm kid from Iowa, who had realized that the fastest way to win a dogfight was to never enter one. Robert Buholtz survived the war. He flew 73 combat missions over Europe. He was credited with 2 aerial victories, both in situations where escape was impossible and fighting was the only option. But his actual contribution was measured differently in missions where he didn't die, in wingmen who followed his example and returned home, in fuel conserved and unnecessary battles avoided. After the war ended, he returned to Iowa. He rarely discussed his service. When asked, he would shrug and say he flew fighters and was lucky. But luck was the wrong word entirely. What Buholtz had done was observe a problem, analyze available data, and act on a conclusion that contradicted accepted wisdom. The doctrine demanded aggressive engagement. The doctrine cost lives, so he questioned it without authority, without rank, without permission. He had only a throttle lever and the courage to push it forward. In 1983, a military historian located him for an oral history project. Buholtz was in his 60s by then, still quiet, still sharp-minded. The historian asked about that March mission, about the 12 fighters, about the decision to run. Buholtz considered the question carefully before answering. He said he wasn't trying to be clever. He just couldn't see any logic in dying when his airplane could go faster than theirs. The P-51 could outrun them, so he let it. The historian asked if he had been afraid. Buholtz nodded. Terrified, he admitted. But fear doesn't mean you stop thinking. Robert Buholtz died in 1996. His obituary occupied 2 paragraphs in a local newspaper. It mentioned his military service, his family, his farm. It said nothing about the day he outran 12 German fighters, and changed how American pilots understood the relationship between speed and survival. But the lesson endured. It survived in every fighter pilot who learned that survival itself is a tactical objective, that discretion is not cowardice, that sometimes the most intelligent response to impossible odds is simply to go faster than your enemy can follow. Buholtz never pursued glory. He pursued the horizon, and in doing so, he gave countless others the chance to do the same.